Pasamos la palabra ahora a David Miller, el representante de la Jamaica Trading Commission.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to begin by thanking CELA, UNCTAD, and the Ecuadorian Competition Authority for giving us the opportunity to be here today and extending such a wonderful facility for us all. I'm going to basically give an idea or a view of what Jamaica's informal sector is like, and then speak briefly on some of the things that our government have considered implementing, some of which have been implemented, and some of which are in the plans to be done. And of course, some of the challenges that us as a competition authority face in looking at the informal sector and the interplay with the formal sector. For Jamaica, a conservative estimate is that 41% of GDP is generated by Jamaica's informal sector. And the business enterprises span the micro, small, medium, and even large firms that do not conform to regulations and in instances evade taxes. We've gone through a process of finding ways not only to identify the informal players, but also to regulate them. And I dare say that other Caribbean countries like ourselves have similar challenges. The informal economy, as we define it, is economic activities in the production and trade of goods and services that are unregistered or which are conducted by unregistered entities and which operate outside of government regulation and taxation systems. And the most common explanation as to why enterprises remain informal is the high cost of doing business as a formal establishment. And I'm not speaking about activities which are necessarily illegal. These are legal activities, just that they remain unregistered. And they claim that the bureaucracy of being registered is high, and of course the taxation system. And tax avoidance in Jamaica is perhaps the single most common reason, and avoidance of the cost of the bureaucracy perhaps the main motivating factor for enterprises to remain informal. The main features of informality in our country are the use of cash as a medium of exchange, receiving payment that is not traceable, and income not reported because of taxation issues, our labor laws, health conditions, safety standards, and for the most part, these entities are self-financed or under-financed, mainly because they experience difficulties in accessing credit. These features invariably provide the informal business persons with a competitive advantage, arising from paying lower taxes, non-compliance with tax requirements, including avoidance of customs duties and statutory payments, and non-compliance with established regulations and standards. A little background of what the size of this economy is. The medium, small, and micro firms employ approximately 84% of our working population, and as such, they're very important. In 2013, there were 1.1 million persons employed in Jamaica, and of that, only 173,000, or about 15%, were employed in large establishments that were formally registered. So this is a big part of our economy. The informal enterprises are concentrated in low productivity, labor-intensive activities, with about 60% of persons operating in the wholesale and retail trade, and another about 15% in the agricultural sector. Most of these firms and persons do not have a bank account, and they're self-sufficient financially. In several instances, they deliberately remain invisible to escape meeting tax and regulatory requirements, and therefore they are less likely to secure large contracts or overseas contracts. And I have a list here of the type of activities which these people are involved in, and like I said earlier, it's not a legal activity. Street vendors, domestic helpers and cleaners, in the production and selling of food products, ground provisions, vegetables and poultry, agro processing, creation and making of jams, jellies, sweets and the like, provision of technical agricultural services, craft for the tourism industry and the arts, music and music production, technical construction services such as masonry, carpentry, electrical, roofing. Then you have the tailors, the dressmakers, the hairdressers, and of course the taxis who compete against the buses, the formal bus sector and transport sector. And there is in fact trade between the formal and informal sectors, wherein for the most part larger firms supply informal, smaller firms with goods. And in several of these markets, the formal firms are facing more and more competition from the informal ones. For example, the wholesale stores and supermarkets, they sell to the street vendors, and they also sell expired goods or goods near to be expired that they do not want to destroy or throw out. You have manufacturers and distributors who supply the small goods on the street corners. The large furniture distributors find it cheaper and more economical to purchase their furniture not only from overseas but also small carpenters and furniture makers who operate in small shops. And with respect to the agricultural sector, there are the formal packaging producers of food, and these formal packagers do not necessarily own their own farms, but they find and purchase their supplies from the small farmers right throughout the country. At the same time, these packaging products persons, they for the most part export their products, and they have to ensure standards of quality, and they transfer these standards down to the small farmers, down to the informal persons to ensure that the quality is maintained. So you have this interplay between the formal and informal in several sectors. And of course, the large formal firms do draw consumers away from the informal sector by offering better terms. For example, in the furniture and appliance sector, they may offer higher purchase arrangements with guarantees or monthly payments, which a small distributor is unable to do. Some persons who are employed in the formal sector also work in the informal sector. Tradesmen, plumbers, electricians, taxi drivers. In their off time, in their non-office hours, they offer their services to consumers. And in doing so, they're competing with their employers. And from time to time, you find that these employees start to set up their own operations and break away from the formal operator to which they were employed previously. So how do we look at this as an authority, and not only us as a competition authority, but the government in general? Competition in this respect is only one aspect in trying to regulate the informal sector. And experiences in recent times has indicated that economic growth is essential for the generation of more and better jobs. There is also the general view that informality comes at a cost to competition and economic development, and that government policy efforts to simplify entry into markets can and do make a difference. Governments like ours should and do recognize the contribution to economic stability of informal sectors. After all, it's a large part of our workforce. The need to facilitate the informal economy as best as possible. The social benefits that comes from it. And of course, capturing and harnessing the gains which arise from it. And in doing all of this, the relationships between the different parties has to be maintained and improved. And to reduce informality, the government has initiated several things to try and get the informal sector to be registered and to count them, to measure them, to be able to recognize them formally. And several of these initiatives are displayed there. Education, information, dissemination, and hand-holding, where we host workshops and seminars that better explain the benefits of formalization and which dispel the notion or perception that remaining informal is better. Registration, having softer registration requirements and social protection programs. Similar incentives, exemption and subsidies, and this is very interesting. The World Bank has argued that some studies of Jamaica's incentives suggest a substantial bias in favor of capital-intensive projects, particularly large projects. Such tax exemptions encourage informality in the business sector and penalize firms with small amounts of capital. And this has come from a history of the larger firms getting tax breaks, which are not available to the smaller, informal sector. And the World Bank is saying we need to have a level playing field here. Then there is training, providing structural training programs, specialized services to all enterprises, where the government offer their services not only to the formal enterprises but to the informal ones as well. Formalizing productive activities, which is implementing policies which guide and ensure compliance with labor standards, raising the skills and the labor force. A simplified taxation system and stronger tax collections. Jamaica's tax structure, I must say, has for long been considered very cumbersome and difficult to navigate through. And this serves as a disincentive as it requires additional time, effort, and resources from small players who are unlikely to have the resources to properly handle their tax obligations. Further, the same tax collection mechanism should be employed to all persons or categories of firms. And this is an issue that has been taken at the front of our priorities by our government in the last 3 or 4 years to make the taxation system easier and encourage persons to come forward and pay their taxes. Then you have collaboration with other government agencies, not ourselves, but all agencies which are involved in the system. A concerted effort with the objective of encouraging formalization without prejudicing the objectives of players in the informal sector, and which address their needs and goals directly. And some of the things include tax amnesties, bulk purchase of raw materials through cooperatives, direct technical assistance, and capacity building projects to the smaller enterprises. I said earlier that these entities are unable to obtain facilities, loan facilities, and there is collaboration with financial institutions where the government facilitates cheaper loans and offer the banks incentives so that they can get the money into the hands of the small enterprises. And of course, employment protection legislation, which includes flex time and tiered system for rates of pay, things like that. Now, how do you regulate trade and competition in this kind of dynamic, since it's such an important part of the economy? The sector has always been active and will always be there, so we have to find ways to embrace it and to deal with it. It is necessary to recognize it at all times and to keep track of it through conducting surveys and questionnaires regularly, which look specifically at the operations of players in the informal trade. Collecting data is a challenging situation in Jamaica, and we're moving in a direction of trying to find ways to better collect the data and to use that data through agencies such as the Customs Department, the Companies Office of Jamaica, and financial information of the formal companies, since they do so much work with the informal ones. As the Fair Trading Commission, we have a responsibility to investigate these firms, and we do encounter them from time to time, and we have to find methods to deal with it. Identifying market players can be a challenge. Defining the relevant markets because of gray areas in terms of market segmentation, the data issue, as I said earlier. And so there's much competition advocacy with other government ministries and agencies and departments to bring these entities into conformation with government regulations and reporting requirements. And a critical part of the issue is also sometimes formal firms become informal ones. And I say that, and this is an example, many of these formal firms become informal by not registering and paying taxes or give up their premises to cut costs and to compete. And therefore, several of these markets begin operating informally and remain informal. And that results in challenges by us and other government agencies in identifying the players and the true size of the markets and the real contribution to consumer welfare and to the economy. The issue also looks specifically at the agricultural sector, since that is a critical part of what we do and how we earn income, especially from exports. And our government has done government subsidies. We make key inputs readily available to the small players, facilitate bulk purchasing of inputs and distribution, financing arrangements, as I said, making an easier tax structure, and make all these things available to all players, not only the formal ones, but the informal ones. And also to create mechanisms that allow the informal players to filter their output into the formal sector. And of course, they are a part of our trade discussions and negotiations as their needs have to be considered at all times. I thank you for listening, and I remain available for discussions if you need be. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, señor Miller. Exposición muy interesante también sobre la situación de la informalidad en su país y lo cierto es que se están tomando también medidas para favorecer ese traspaso de la informalidad a la formalidad a través de medidas de facilitación más bien que medidas represivas, y lo cual pues yo creo que es más favorable a que este problema, que siempre persistirá, eso está claro, pero que se vaya por lo menos disminuyendo.